Lawrence Sullivan (Sul) Ross was the 19th governor of Texas, a Confederate States Army general during the American Civil War, and a president of the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas, now called Texas A&amp University. Ross was raised in the Republic of Texas, which was later annexed to the United States. Much of his childhood was spent on the frontier, where his family founded the town of Waco. As a teenager, Ross attended Baylor University. On one of his summer breaks, he suffered severe injuries while fighting Comanches. After graduation, Ross joined the Texas Rangers, and in 1860, led troops in the Battle of Peace River, where he rescued Cynthia Ann Parker, who had been captured by the Comanches as a child. When Texas seceded from the United States and joined the Confederacy, Ross joined the Confederate States Army. He participated in 135 battles and skirmishes and became one of the youngest Confederate generals. Following the Civil War, Ross briefly served as sheriff of McLennan County before resigning to participate in the 1875 Texas Constitutional Convention. With the exception of a two-year term as a state senator, Ross spent the next decade focused on his farm and ranch concerns. In 1887, he became the 19th governor of Texas. During his two terms, he oversaw the dedication of the new Texas state capitol, resolved the Jaybird Woodpecker War, and became the only Texas governor to call a special session to deal with a treasury surplus. Despite his popularity, Ross refused to run for a third term as governor. Days after leaving office, he became president of the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas. He is credited with saving the school from closure, and his tenure saw a large expansion in college facilities and the birth of many school traditions. After his death, the Texas legislature created Sul-Ross State University in his honor. Early years. Lawrence Sullivan Ross was born on September 27, 1838 in Bentonsport, Iowa Territory. He was the fourth child and second son of Shapley Prince Ross and Catherine Fulkerson, the daughter of Missouri legislator Isaac Fulkerson. Ross was jointly named for his paternal uncle, Charles O. Sullivan, and his father's grandfather and brother, both named Lawrence Ross. The senior Lawrence Ross had been captured by Native Americans as a child, and lived with them from the time he was 6 years old until he was rescued at 23. To differentiate Ross from his uncle and great-grandfather, he was called Little Sul when he was a child, and later Sul. Shortly after Ross's birth, his parents sold their Iowa property and returned to Missouri to escape Iowa's cold weather. In 1839, the family moved to the Republic of Texas, where they settled in the Robertson Colony on the lower Brazos River. 2 years later, they joined 7 other families under Captain Daniel Monroe and settled near present-day Cameron, where they received 640 acres of land along the Little River. The land adjoined Comanche territory and was raided several times. In 1845, the family moved to Austin so Ross and his older siblings could attend school. 4 years later, they relocated again. By this time, Shapley Ross was well known as a frontiersman, and to coax him to settle in the newly formed community of Waco, the family was given 4 city lots, exclusive rights to operate a ferry across the Brazos River, and the right to buy 80 acres of farmland at $1 per acre. In March 1849, the Ross family built the first house in Waco, a double log cabin on a bluff overlooking the springs. Ross's sister Kate soon became the first Caucasian child born in Waco. Eager to further his education, Ross entered the preparatory department at Baylor University in 1856. Despite the fact that he was several years older than most of the other students, he completed the 2-year study course in 1 year. Following his graduation, he enrolled at Wesleyan University in Florence, Alabama. The Wesleyan faculty originally deemed his mathematics knowledge so lacking, they refused his admittance. The decision was rescinded after a professor agreed to tutor Ross privately in the subject. At Wesleyan, students lived with prominent families instead of congregating in dormitories, thus giving them daily exposure to good manners and refinement. Ross lived with the family of his tutor. Wichita Village Fight. During the summer of 1858, Ross returned to Texas and journeyed to the Brazos Indian Reserve, where his father served as Indian agent. The United States Army had conscripted Indians from the reserve to help the Wichita expedition of 2nd Cavalry in a search for Buffalo Hump, a Panatica Comanche chief who had led several deadly raids on Texas settlements. Fearing that Shapley Ross was too ill to command them on the expedition, the Indians named Sul Ross the new war chief. With his father's approval, the younger Ross led the 135 warriors to accompany 225 troops led by Brevet Major Earl Van Dorn. Ross was given the courtesy title of captain during his command. Native scouts found about 500 Comanches, including Buffalo Hump, camped outside a Wichita village in Indian Territory. Early in the battle, Ross and his men successfully stampeded the Comanche horses, leaving the Comanche warriors at a disadvantage when facing the mounted troops. When many Comanche tried to flee the area, Ross, one of his scouts, Lieutenant Cornelius Van Camp of the 2nd Cavalry, and one of his troopers chased a party of non-combatants that appeared to contain a white child. On Ross's orders, his man grabbed the child. As the four turned to rejoin the battle, they were confronted by 25 Comanche warriors. The Van Camp and the private were killed with arrows, and Ross received an arrow through his shoulder. A Comanche picked up the trooper's carbine and fired a .58 caliber bullet through Ross's chest. His attacker, Mohi, was a Comanche brave Ross had known since childhood. Mohi was killed by buckshot fired by Lieutenant James Majors of the 2nd Cavalry as the warrior approached the temporarily paralyzed Ross with a scalping knife. After 5 hours of fighting, the troops subdued the Comanche resistance. Buffalo Hump escaped, but 70 Comanches were killed and mortally wounded, only 2 of them non-combatants. Ross's injuries were severe, and for 5 days he lay under a tree on the battlefield, unable to be moved. His wounds became infected, and Ross begged the others to kill him to end his pain. When he was able to travel, he was first carried on a litter suspended between 2 mules, and then on the shoulders of his men. He recovered fully, but experienced some pain for much of the rest of the year. In his written report, Van Dorn praised Ross highly. The Dallas Herald printed the report on October 10, and other state newspapers also praised Ross's bravery. General Winfield Scott learned of Ross's role and offered him a direct commission in the Army. Eager to finish his education, Ross declined Scott's offer and returned to school in Alabama. The following year, Ross graduated from Wesleyan with a Bachelor of Arts and returned to Texas. Once there, he discovered no one had been able to trace the family of the young Caucasian girl rescued during the Wichita Village Fight. He adopted the child and named her Lizzie Ross in honor of his new fiancée, Lizzie Tinsley. Texas Rangers. Enlistment. In early 1860, Ross enlisted in Captain J.M. Smith's Waco Company of Texas Rangers, which formed to fight the renegade Native Americans. Smith appointed Ross his second lieutenant. When Smith was promoted, the other men in the company unanimously voted to make Ross the new captain. In conjunction with several other ranger companies, Ross led his men to retaliate against a Kickapoo tribe which had murdered 2 white families. The tribe had been warned of the Rangers' approach and set the prairie ablaze. The Rangers were forced to abandon the mission when confronted with the massive wildfire. Smith disbanded Ross's company in early September 1860. Within a week, Governor Sam Houston authorized Ross to raise his own company of 60 mounted volunteers to protect the settlements near Belknap from Native American attacks. Ross and his men arrived at Fort Belknap on October 17, 1860 to find the local citizens they were sworn to protect had passed a resolution asking Ross to resign his commission and leave the frontier. The citizens erroneously believed the raiding was committed by Native Americans from the reservations, and they feared Ross's friendship with those on the reservations would make him ineffective. Battle of Peace River in late October and November 1860, Comanches led by Nocona conducted numerous raids on various settlements, culminating in the brutal killing of a pregnant woman. On hearing of these incidents, Houston sent several 25-man companies to assist Ross. A citizens' posse had tracked the raiders to the winter village along the Peace River. As the village contained at least 500 warriors and many women and children, the posse returned to the settlements to recruit additional fighters. Ross requested help from the U.S. Army at Camp Cooper, which sent 21 troops. Immediately after the soldiers arrived on December 11, Ross and 39 Rangers departed for the Comanche village. On December 13, they met the civilian posse, which had grown to 69 members. After several days of travel, the fast pace and poor foraging forced the civilians to stop and rest their horses. The Rangers and soldiers continued on. When they neared the village, Ross personally scouted ahead. Hidden from view by a dust storm, he was able to get within 200 yards of the village and saw signs that the tribe was preparing to move on. Realizing his own horses were too tired for a long pursuit, Ross resolved to attack immediately before the civilians were able to rejoin the group. Ross led the Rangers down the ridge, while the soldiers circled around to cut off the Comanche retreat. After fierce fighting, the Comanches fled. Ross and several of his men pursued the chief and a second, unknown, rider. As the Rangers neared, the second rider slowed and held a child over her head. The men did not shoot, but instead surrounded and stopped her. Ross continued to follow the chief, eventually shooting him 3 times. The chief refused to surrender, even after falling from his horse. Ross's cook, Anton Martinez, who had been a captive in Nocona's band, identified the fallen chief as Nocona. With Ross's permission, Martinez fired the shot that took Nocona's life. Nocona was the only Comanche male to die in the fighting. 13 Comanche women were also killed. Ross's men suffered no casualties. The civilian posse arrived at the battleground as the fighting finished. Although they initially congratulated Ross for winning the battle, some of them later complained that Ross had pushed ahead without them so he would not have to share the glory of the spoils of war. When Ross arrived back at the campground, he realized the captured woman had blue eyes. The woman could not speak English and did not remember her birth name or details of her life prior to joining the Comanche. After much questioning, she was able to provide a few details of her capture as a child. The details matched what Ross knew of the 1836 Fort Parker massacre, so he summoned Colonel Isaac Parker to identify her. When Parker mentioned his kidnapped niece had been named Cynthia Ann Parker, the woman slapped her chest and said, "Miss Cynthia Ann." Parker never returned to the Comanche people, but was not happy to have been rescued by Ross. In contrast, Ross's intervention was welcomed by a 9-year-old Indian boy found hiding alone in the tall grass. Ross took the child with him, naming him Pease. Though Pease was later given the choice to return to his people, he refused and was raised by Ross. The Battle of Pease River cemented Ross's fame. His aggressive tactics of carrying the war to the Comanche fireside ended charges of softness in dealing with the Indians. Quote, after Ross's death, however, Nokona's son Quanah maintained his father was not present at the battle, and instead died 3 or 4 years later. Quanah identified the man Martinez shot as a Mexican captive who was the personal servant of Nokona's wife, Cynthia and Parker. Resignation. When Ross returned home, Houston asked him to disband the company and form a new company of 83 men, promising to send written directives soon. While Ross was in the process of supervising this reorganization, Houston appointed Captain William C. Dalrymple as his new aide-de-camp with overall command of the Texas Rangers. Dalrymple, unaware of Houston's verbal orders, castigated Ross for disbanding his company. Ross completed the reorganization of the company, then returned to Waco and resigned his commission. In his letter of resignation, effective February 1861, Ross informed Houston of his encounter with Dalrymple, and noted he did not believe a ranger company could be effective if the captain did not report solely to the governor. Houston offered to appoint Ross as an aide-de-camp with the rank of colonel, but Ross refused. Civil War service. Enlistment. In early 1861, after Texas voted to secede from the United States and join the Confederacy, Ross's brother Peter began recruiting men for a new military company. Shortly after Ross enlisted in his brother's company as a private, Governor Edward Clark requested he instead proceed immediately to the Indian Territory to negotiate treaties with the 5 civilized tribes so they would not help the Union Army. 1 week after his May 28 wedding to Lizzie Tinsley, Ross set out for the Indian Territory. Upon reaching the Washita Agency, he discovered the Confederate commissioners had already signed a preliminary treaty with the tribes. Ross returned home for several months. In the middle of August, he departed with his company for Missouri, leaving his wife with her parents. On September 7, his group became Company G of Stone's regiment, later known as the 6th Texas Cavalry. The other men elected Ross as the major for the regiment. Twice in November 1861, Ross was chosen by General McCulloch, with whom he had served in the Texas Rangers, the lead scouting force near Springfield, Missouri. Both times, Ross successfully slipped behind the Union Army lines, gathered information, and retreated before being caught. After completing the missions, he was granted a 60-day leave and returned home to visit his wife. Active duty. In early 1862, Ross returned to duty. By late February, he and 500 troops were assigned to raid the Union Army. He led the group 70 miles behind the enemy lines, where they gathered intelligence, destroyed several wagon loads of commissary supplies, captured 60 horses and mules, and took 11 prisoners. The following month, the regiment was assigned to Earl Van Dorn, now a major general, with whom Ross had served during the battle at the Wichita Village. Under Van Dorn, the group suffered a defeat at the Battle of Pea Ridge. Ross attributed the loss solely to Van Dorn, and blamed him for overmarching and underfeeding his troops, and for failing to properly coordinate the plan of attack. In April, the group was sent to Des Arc, Arkansas. Because of the scarcity of forage, Ross's cavalry troop was ordered to dismount and send the horses back to Texas. The unit, now on foot, traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, arriving 2 weeks after the Battle of Shiloh. Ross soon caught a bad cold accompanied by a lingering fever and was extremely ill for 8 weeks. By the time he considered himself cured, his weight had dwindled dwindled to only 125 pounds. Over Ross's protests, the men of the 6th Regiment elected him colonel in 1862. He did not want the responsibility of the position and had not wanted to embarrass a friend who wanted the job. The brigade commander, General Charles W. Pfeiffer, was often absent, leaving Ross in charge. Ross's actions impressed other officers, and several times during the summer of 1862, he was nominated for promotion to brigadier general. Although he was not promoted at the time, his unit was the only one of the 8 to 10 dismounted cavalry units in the area to be promised the return of the horses. While still afoot, Ross and his men participated in the Battle of Corinth. Under Ross's command, his Texans twice captured Union guns at Battery Robinette. They were forced to retreat from the position each time as reinforcements failed to arrive. During the battle, Ross, who had acquired a horse, was bucked off, leading his men to believe he had been killed. He was actually unharmed. The Confederate Army retreated from the battle and found themselves facing more Union troops at Hatchie's Bridge. Ross led 700 riflemen to engage the Union troops. For 3 hours, his men held off 7,000 Union troops, repulsing 3 major enemy assaults. The 6th Cavalry's horses arrived soon after the battle, and the regiment was transferred to the cavalry brigade of Colonel William H. Red Jackson. Ross was permitted to take a few weeks' leave in November 1862 to visit his wife, and returned to his regiment in mid-January 1863. Several months later, his unit participated in the Battle of Thompson's Station. In July, Major General Stephen D. Lee joined the 6th Texas Cavalry with Colonel R. A. Pinson's 1st Mississippi Cavalry, creating a new brigade with Ross at the helm. Near the same time, Ross received word that his first child had died, possibly stillborn. Ross fell ill again in September 1863. From September 27 through March 1864, he suffered recurring attacks of fever and chills every 3 days, symptomatic of tertian malaria. Despite his illness, Ross never missed a day of duty, and in early 1864 he was promoted to brigadier general, becoming the 9th youngest general officer of the Confederate Army. Following his promotion, unit morale improved, and every one of his men re-enlisted. In March 1864, Ross's brigade fought against African American soldiers for the first time at Yazoo City, Mississippi. After bitter fighting, the Confederates were victorious. During the surrender negotiations, the Union officer accused the Texans of murdering several captured African American soldiers. Ross claimed 2 of his men had likewise been killed after surrendering to Union troops. Beginning in May, the brigade endured 112 consecutive days of skirmishes, comprising 86 separate clashes with the enemy. Though most of the skirmishes were small, by the end of the period, injuries and desertion had cut the regiment's strength by 25%. Ross was captured in late July at the Battle of Brown's Mill, but was quickly rescued by a successful Confederate cavalry counterattack. The last major military campaign was the Franklin-Nashville Campaign of November and December 1864. Ross and his men led the Confederate advance into Tennessee. Between the beginning of November and December 27, his men captured 550 prisoners, several hundred horses, and enough overcoats and blankets to survive the winter chill. Only 12 of Ross's men were killed, with 70 wounded and 5 captured. Surrender. By the time Ross began a 90-day furlough on March 13, 1865, he had participated in 135 engagements with the enemy, and his horse had been shot out from under him 5 times, yet he had escaped serious injury. With his leave approved, Ross hurried home to Texas to visit the wife he had not seen in 2 years. While at home, the Confederate Army began its surrender. He had not rejoined his regiment when it surrendered in Jackson, Mississippi, on May 14, 1865. Because he was not present at the surrender, Ross did not receive a parole protecting him from arrest. As a Confederate Army officer over the rank of colonel, Ross was also exempted from President Andrew Johnson's amnesty proclamation of May 29, 1865, to prevent his arrest and the confiscation of his property. On August 4, 1865, Ross applied for a special pardon for his treason against the United States. Johnson personally approved Ross's application on October 22, 1866, but Ross did not receive and formally accept the pardon until July 1867. Farming and early public service. When the Civil War ended, Ross was just 26 years old. He owned 160 acres of farmland along the South Bosque River west of Waco, and 5.41 acres in town. For the first time, he and his wife were able to establish their own home. They expanded the family, having 8 children over the next 17 years. Despite his federal pardon for being a Confederate general, Ross was disqualified from voting and serving as a juror by the first Reconstruction Act of March 2, 1867. This act, and the Supplementary Reconstruction Act passed 3 weeks later, disenfranchised anyone who had held a federal estate office before supporting the Confederacy. Reconstruction did not harm Ross's fortune, and with hard work, he soon prospered. Shortly after the war ended, he bought 20 acres of land in town from his parents for $1,500. By May 1869, he had purchased an additional 40 acres of farmland for $400, and the following year his wife inherited 186 acres of farmland from the estate of her father. Ross continued to buy land, and by the end of 1875, he owned over 1,000 acres of farmland. Besides farming, Ross and his brother Peter also raised shorthorn cattle. The two led several trail drives to New Orleans. The combined farming and ranching incomes left Ross wealthy enough to build a house in the Waco city limits and to send his children to private school. By 1873, Reconstruction in Texas was coming to an end. In December, Ross was elected sheriff of McLennan County, without campaigning or other solicitation. Ross promptly named his brother Peter a deputy, and within 2 years, they had arrested over 700 outlaws. In 1874, Ross helped establish the Sheriff's Association of Texas. After various state newspapers publicized the event, sheriffs representing 65 Texas counties met in Corsicana in August 1874. Ross became one of a committee of 3 assigned to draft resolutions for the convention. They asked for greater pay for sheriffs in certain circumstances, condemned the spirit of mob law, and proposed that state law be modified so arresting officers could use force if necessary to compel the criminal to obey the mandates of the law. Ross resigned as sheriff in 1875 and was soon elected as a delegate to the 1875 Texas Constitutional Convention, one of 3 members appointed to wait upon convention president-elect T.B. Pickett. Ross was also named to a committee that would determine what officers and employees were needed by the convention. He sat on many other committees, including Revenue and Taxation, the Select Committee on Frontier Affairs, the Select Committee on Education, and the Standing Committee on the Legislative Department. Of the 68 days of the convention, Ross attended 63, voted 343 times, and missed or abstained from voting only 66 times. When the convention concluded, Ross returned home and spent the next 4 years years focusing on his farm. In 1880, he became an accidental candidate for Texas state senator from the 22nd District. The nominating convention deadlocked between two candidates, with neither receiving a two-thirds majority. As a compromise, one of the delegates suggested the group nominate Ross. Although no one asked Ross whether he wanted to run for office, the delegates elected him as a candidate. He agreed to the nomination to spare the trouble and expense of another convention. Ross won the election with a large majority. Shortly after his arrival in Austin, his youngest son died. Ross returned home for a week to attend the funeral and help care for another son who was seriously ill. On returning to the state capital, he was assigned to the committees for educational affairs, internal improvements, finance, penitentiaries, military affairs, state affairs, contingent expenses, stock and stock raising, agricultural affairs, and enrolled bills. Ross introduced a petition on behalf of 500 citizens of McLennan County, requesting a prohibition amendment to be placed on the next statewide ballot. The legislature did agree to place this on the next ballot. Although the Texas legislature typically meets once every 2 years, a fire destroyed the state capitol building in November 1881, and Ross was called to serve in a special session in April 1882. The session agreed to build a new Capitol building. Near the end of the special session, the Senate passed a reapportionment bill, which reduced Ross's 4-year term to only 2 years. He declined to run again.